For most people, the idea of a safe asset feels intuitive. Gold feels safe because it is physical. Cash feels safe because it is liquid. Real estate feels safe because you can touch it. Government bonds feel safe because they are backed by the state itself. Even crypto, for a newer generation, feels safe because it is decentralized and outside traditional banks. The problem is that history has a long memory, and it tells a very different story. Almost every asset that people instinctively label as safe has already been interfered with, restricted, frozen, seized, or quietly neutralized by governments when circumstances demanded it. Start with gold, the oldest store of value in human history. In 1933, during the Great Depression, the United States government issued Executive Order 6102, making it illegal for American citizens to own most forms of monetary gold. Private gold holdings were confiscated or forcibly sold to the government at a fixed price. This was not a failed state or a dictatorship. It was the United States acting entirely within its legal framework. Similar episodes occurred in the United Kingdom, Australia, and India at different times. Gold did not fail as an asset, but its owners discovered that physical possession does not equal legal control when the state decides otherwise. Cash and bank deposits fare no better. People often assume that money in the bank is their money, yet legally it is a liability of the bank, not property held on their behalf. When Cyprus faced a banking crisis in 2013, depositors woke up to find part of their savings confiscated through a bail-in. In Lebanon, withdrawal limits and capital controls effectively trapped depositors' money for years, even though balances still appeared on screens. Argentina has repeatedly frozen bank accounts during crises, turning cash into an accounting fiction. These were not temporary glitches. They were policy choices made under pressure. Real estate, another perceived safe haven, is even more deeply entangled with state power. Property exists because of registries, zoning laws, tax systems, and enforcement mechanisms. Governments rarely need to seize land outright. They can impose new taxes, restrict usage, block sales, or redefine ownership rules. From post-war Europe to modern Venezuela, property owners have learned that land is only as secure as the political environment that recognizes it. A house that cannot be sold, rented, or legally transferred is not confiscated on paper, but its economic value is quietly hollowed out. Crypto is often presented as a counterexample. It cannot be seized physically. It can be self-custodied. It exists outside traditional registries. Yet, even here, the assumption of immunity breaks down under scrutiny. Governments do not need to confiscate crypto directly to control it. They regulate exchanges, enforce KYC rules, monitor on-ramps and off-ramps, and tax transactions. In China, crypto ownership was not physically seized, but the ecosystem was effectively dismantled through legal pressure. In many countries, crypto is tolerated only so long as it passes through identifiable intermediaries. The asset survives, but its usability shrinks. These examples point to a deeper issue. People often misunderstand how state power actually operates. Confiscation is not primarily about police knocking on doors or soldiers taking assets by force. It is about law, registries, compliance, and choke points. Governments are extraordinarily effective at controlling systems that are legible to them. If an asset can be clearly defined, registered, owned, taxed, and transferred within a legal jurisdiction, it can almost always be influenced, restricted, or redirected. This leads to an uncomfortable conclusion. The very qualities that make an asset feel safe in normal times, clarity of ownership, legal recognition, ease of transfer, institutional backing, are the same qualities that make it vulnerable in extreme times. Safety in a stable system does not translate to safety during systemic stress. In fact, it often works in reverse. Historically, governments expand their reach most aggressively during crises. Wars, financial collapses, currency crises, and social unrest all justify extraordinary measures. Capital controls are introduced temporarily. Emergency taxes become permanent. Exceptional laws become precedent. In those moments, the state's priority is not the preservation of individual wealth, but the preservation of the system itself. Assets that are easily visible and easily governed become tools for stabilization. This is why debates about which asset is safest often miss the point. They focus on the object rather than the structure. They ask whether gold is better than crypto or real estate better than stocks, without examining the mechanisms through which control is applied. The question is not which asset is strongest in theory. The question is which assets are easiest for a government to grab, freeze, regulate, or dilute without collapsing its own legal foundations. To understand this, one must recognize a simple rule. State power requires an anchor. That anchor can be a registry, a bank, a legal title, a centralized intermediary, or a recognized jurisdiction. Without such anchors, enforcement becomes expensive, politically risky, or legally inconsistent. States prefer assets they can influence quietly, procedurally, and at scale. They avoid actions that openly undermine property law itself, because that erodes trust in the system they rely on. This explains why confiscation is often subtle. Instead of taking assets outright, governments change the rules around them. They redefine what is taxable. They restrict movement across borders. They impose reporting requirements that transform privacy into liability. They mandate conversions, as when currencies are redenominated or deposits are forcibly swapped for bonds. The asset still exists, but the owner's control over it is reduced. Seen through this lens, the idea of an asset that governments cannot easily confiscate begins to look less like a magical object and more like a structural anomaly. Such an asset would not be defined primarily by physical form or digital scarcity. It would be defined by the absence of a clean legal handle. It would not sit neatly inside a single jurisdiction. It would not rely on a centralized intermediary to function. And most importantly, interfering with it would create legal contradictions or systemic damage that governments generally try to avoid. At this stage, it is important to be precise. Hard to confiscate does not mean impossible to regulate. It does not mean invisible or illegal. It means that the cost of interference is high relative to the benefit, especially when compared to more conventional assets. Governments are pragmatic actors. They choose the path of least resistance. If an asset requires rewriting foundational legal principles to control, it tends to remain untouched or only indirectly influenced. This is where most public discussions stop too early. They assume that if an asset has not been widely confiscated yet, it must be safe. Or they assume that if something is decentralized, it is automatically beyond reach. Both assumptions are flawed. Safety is contextual. It emerges from incentives, legal structures, and trade-offs, not from slogans. Before identifying what kind of asset truly fits this profile, it is necessary to understand the tools governments actually use and the limits of those tools. Without that understanding, any claim about confiscation-proof assets becomes marketing rather than analysis. The next step is to examine, in detail, how states exert control over wealth and where that control reliably breaks down. To understand which assets are difficult for governments to confiscate, it is necessary to move away from dramatic images of force and focus instead on how power is exercised in practice. States rarely rely on brute seizure because it is costly, visible, and politically destabilizing. Instead, modern governments exert control through legal architecture. Confiscation, in most cases, is not an event but a process. It unfolds through paperwork, compliance requirements, and structural choke points that make resistance impractical or illegal. At the core of this process is legibility. Governments govern what they can clearly see, define, and categorize. An asset becomes governable when it is legible within a legal framework, when it has a recognized owner, a documented form, a jurisdiction, and a set of rules governing its transfer. This is why registries matter so much. Land registries, corporate registries, securities depositories, and banking ledgers are not neutral record-keeping tools. They are the foundation of enforceable control. Once an asset is recorded in a registry, it can be taxed, frozen, reassigned, or restricted with a legal signature. Intermediaries amplify this power. Banks, brokers, custodians, exchanges, and clearinghouses act as compliance multipliers. Governments do not need to monitor millions of individuals directly when they can regulate a few thousand institutions. Anti-money laundering rules, know your customer requirements, and reporting obligations turn intermediaries into extensions of the state. When an account is frozen, it is rarely because a government physically intervenes. It is because an intermediary is legally obligated to act on its behalf. This structure allows control to scale. Taxation functions similarly. Tax is not just a revenue tool. It is an enforcement mechanism. To tax an asset, the state must first define it, value it, and link it to a legal person. This process generates data, and data creates leverage. Assets that must be declared annually, appraised periodically, or reported upon transfer are continuously reaffirming their presence within the state's reach. Even when taxes are low, the compliance infrastructure remains intact, ready to be expanded during emergencies. Jurisdiction is another critical component. Legal authority is territorial. States can only reliably enforce rules within their recognized boundaries. This is why assets anchored to a single jurisdiction are especially vulnerable during crises. When capital controls are imposed, money cannot leave. When property laws change, owners have no alternative legal venue. Cross-border diversification helps at the margins, but it does not eliminate the problem. Multiple jurisdictions still mean multiple legal anchors, each with its own points of leverage. Historical crises illustrate how these mechanisms work together. During World War I and World War II, many governments imposed capital controls, restricted gold ownership, and mandated the purchase of war bonds. These measures were not framed as confiscation, but as patriotic or temporary necessities. Compliance was achieved through banks, employers, and legal penalties rather than mass enforcement. Similarly, during financial crises, emergency banking laws allowed deposit freezes or forced restructurings, often justified as necessary to prevent systemic collapse. What matters is not the ideology of the government, but the incentives it faces. In a crisis, the state's priority is stability, maintaining the currency, funding essential services, and preventing social unrest. Assets that can be mobilized quickly and predictably become tools of policy. This is why large, visible pools of wealth are attractive targets. Pension funds can be redirected into government bonds. Bank deposits can be converted through bail-ins. Real estate can be taxed more heavily. These actions are legally cleaner than inventing entirely new mechanisms. This leads to a subtle but crucial insight. Governments prefer to act where the law already provides them with discretion. They expand existing powers rather than creating entirely new ones. For example, if a government already has the authority to tax capital gains, it can raise rates or alter definitions. If it already regulates banks, it can impose withdrawal limits. If it already controls land use, it can redefine zoning or ownership conditions. Confiscation is often the cumulative effect of many small, legal changes rather than a single dramatic act. The effectiveness of these tools depends on predictability. States need assets to behave in consistent ways. They need transfers to be observable, ownership to be stable, and valuation to be possible. Assets that are highly standardized and widely held fit this requirement well. Ironically, financial innovation often increases vulnerability by improving efficiency and transparency. What makes an asset easy to trade also makes it easy to regulate. This is where many assumptions about decentralization break down. An asset can be technologically decentralized, yet economically centralized. If most users rely on a small number of platforms, service providers, or gateways, those become pressure points. Regulation does not need to target the asset itself. It targets the ecosystem that makes the asset useful at scale. This has been evident in how governments approach digital assets, peer-to-peer platforms, and even informal economies. Conversely, assets that resist control tend to lack one or more of these features. They may not have a single registry. Ownership may be ambiguous or relational rather than absolute. Transfer may occur through social, contractual, or reputational mechanisms rather than formal markets. Valuation may be subjective or context-dependent. Such assets are frustrating to govern because they do not align neatly with existing legal categories. However, this does not mean they are illegal or hidden. In fact, many of them operate openly. The difficulty lies in translating them into enforceable rules without undermining broader legal principles. For example, enforcing strict control over something that resembles a personal right or a distributed capability can conflict with constitutional protections or international norms. Governments are cautious in such areas because overreach can create unintended consequences. Another important limit is enforcement cost. Even when legal authority exists, enforcement requires resources and political capital. Chasing millions of small, loosely defined assets is inefficient. States focus on high-impact interventions. This is why wealth concentration matters. The more concentrated and formalized wealth becomes, the easier it is to influence. Dispersed, heterogeneous forms of value are less attractive targets, even if their aggregate value is significant. This framework helps explain why some forms of wealth persist through repeated political and economic upheavals without ever being formally confiscated. They do not present a clean surface for policy action. There is no single law that can neutralize them without creating contradictions elsewhere in the legal system. Attempting to do so would require redefining concepts like personal autonomy, contractual freedom, or professional mobility, which most states are reluctant to do explicitly. At this point, the question becomes sharper. If governments control assets through registries, intermediaries, taxation, and jurisdiction, then the assets hardest to confiscate are those that minimize exposure to these mechanisms. Not by hiding, but by existing in forms that do not require constant legal recognition to retain value. Not by opposing the state, but by being structurally inconvenient for it to interfere with. Identifying such assets requires abandoning the conventional notion of wealth as something that sits in an account or a vault. It requires thinking in terms of structure rather than substance. Only then does it become possible to see why certain forms of value endure across borders, regimes, and crises, not because they're protected, but because they're difficult to meaningfully target. By this point, it should be clear that the question is not whether governments can confiscate assets in theory, but which assets are costly and inefficient to interfere with in practice. This is where many discussions take a wrong turn. They immediately jump to secrecy, evasion, or legality, as if the only way to avoid state control is to hide. That assumption misunderstands how power works. The most resilient forms of wealth are not hidden from the system. They simply do not fit cleanly into it. It is tempting to think first of assets that are physically portable or digitally encrypted. Gold coins buried underground. Private keys memorized and never written down. Offshore accounts shielded by complex legal structures. These methods can reduce exposure, but they are tactical, not structural. They depend on secrecy, constant vigilance, and favorable conditions. Once discovered or disrupted, they revert to being ordinary, legible assets again. States have centuries of experience breaking secrecy. They are far less patient with structures that openly resist classification. The more interesting category of assets resists confiscation for a different reason. It does not present a single, stable target. There is no centralized registry that defines its existence. There is no authoritative ledger that assigns ownership once and for all. Its value does not depend on legal recognition by a specific jurisdiction. And critically, interfering with it directly would require governments to undermine principles they rely on elsewhere. To see the difference, consider two individuals during a systemic crisis. The first holds most of their wealth in well-documented assets, bank deposits, publicly registered securities, titled real estate. Everything is clear, auditable, and compliant. In normal times, this clarity feels like safety. In a crisis, it becomes exposure. Policies can be implemented overnight that affect millions of such assets simultaneously. The individual has no meaningful exit because the same systems that protect ownership also constrain it. The second individual holds a large portion of their wealth in assets that are not anchored to a single registry or intermediary. Their value is embedded in arrangements, relationships, capabilities, and distributed structures. No single document proves ownership in a way that can be easily overridden. No single institution can be compelled to freeze or transfer it. Attempting to seize it would involve chasing a moving target across legal boundaries and social contexts. The state can influence parts of it, but not neutralize it at once. This distinction explains why certain forms of wealth survive regime changes, currency collapses, and even expropriation campaigns. Historically, when states nationalized industries or seized land, some individuals lost everything overnight, while others retained economic power despite losing formal property. They did so not by hiding assets, but by controlling things that could not be nationalized without destroying their usefulness. One way to understand this is to focus on dependence. Assets that require ongoing validation by the state are vulnerable. Assets that retain value through continued voluntary participation by others are more resilient. If value exists because people choose to engage with it, rather than because a registry enforces it, then confiscation becomes conceptually harder. The state can prohibit participation, but enforcement becomes diffuse and costly, especially when participation crosses borders or jurisdictions. This is also where the debate around decentralization becomes more nuanced. True resistance to confiscation does not come from technical decentralization alone. It comes from functional decentralization. Who needs to cooperate for the asset to retain value? How many independent actors are involved? Can value be realized without passing through a small number of regulated gateways? If the answer involves many independent decisions rather than a few institutional approvals, control becomes blunt rather than precise. Another overlooked factor is time. Confiscation is easiest when value is static. A house sits in one place. A bank balance remains on a ledger. Even a stock is defined at a point in time. Assets that are dynamic, evolving, or context-dependent resist this. Their value emerges over time through use, adaptation, and recombination. Freezing them at a single moment does not capture what makes them valuable. In legal terms, they are harder to take because there is no clear moment of transfer. Importantly, none of this requires antagonism toward the state. These assets often exist comfortably within legal systems. They pay taxes when appropriate. They are disclosed when necessary. What makes them resilient is not defiance but dispersion. There is no lever that, when pulled, causes the entire asset to collapse into state control. This also clarifies why wealth concentration is dangerous. The more wealth is compressed into standardized, easily measurable forms, the more tempting and feasible it becomes a target. Concentration simplifies policy. Dispersion complicates it. Governments respond rationally to this asymmetry. They focus on assets that offer high impact per unit of legal effort. At this point, it becomes possible to say what these assets are not. They are not commodities in the traditional sense. They are not entries in a financial account. They are not objects that can be seized and stored. Their value cannot be transferred by decree. They cannot be reassigned with change in law without undermining the legal coherence of the system itself. What they are begins to emerge indirectly. They resemble rights more than things, but not rights granted by the state. They resemble property, but not property that depends on a title. They function across borders without needing to be physically moved. They are accumulated gradually and often invisibly, and most people do not instinctively label them as assets at all. This is why they are so often ignored in discussions of wealth preservation. They do not fit into balance sheets. They do not have daily prices. They do not generate headlines. Yet when formal assets fail, these forms of value continue to operate. People with access to them retain optionality. People without to become trapped inside whatever legal and financial constraints emerge. The final irony is that states themselves rely heavily on these assets. Economies function because individuals possess them. Markets depend on them. Institutions cannot operate without them. To fully confiscate or nationalize them would be to attack the very substrate on which governance rests. Only now does the central claim become visible. The assets that governments cannot easily confiscate are not hidden treasures or technological loopholes. They are forms of value that do not present a stable, centralized target. They are structurally inconvenient to seize because doing so will require the state to contradict its own foundations. The next step is to name this asset class explicitly and explain why, despite its resilience, It remains undervalued and misunderstood by most people. At this point, the asset class can be named directly, without mystique or exaggeration. The form of wealth that governments cannot easily confiscate is not a thing at all. It is human capital, embedded in portable, market-validated capability and jurisdiction-agnostic structure. In simpler terms, it is a combination of skills, knowledge, reputation, networks, and legal optionality that allows an individual to generate value across systems rather than inside a single one. This answer often disappoints people because it does not feel like an asset in the conventional sense. It cannot be stored in a vault. It does not appear on a statement. It cannot be passed down cleanly through inheritance. There is no ticker symbol and no daily price. Yet, when examined through the same structural lens used for other assets, it becomes clear why it behaves differently under pressure. Human capital, when narrowly defined as education or job skills, is not what matters here. A licensed profession tied to one country, one regulator, or one employer is highly legible and therefore vulnerable. What matters is non-sovereign human capital, capabilities that are recognized by markets rather than granted by states, and that can be redeployed across borders with minimal permission. Consider how governments would attempt to confiscate such an asset. There is no registry that defines it. There is no document that can be voided to erase it. There is no intermediary that can be ordered to freeze it entirely. A state can restrict employment, raise taxes, or impose licensing requirements, but these measures do not transfer the asset to the state. At most, they reduce local usability. The asset itself remains intact and portable. History provides many quiet examples of this dynamic. During periods of nationalization in the 20th century, factory owners and landholders often lost everything. Engineers, traders, surgeons, and entrepreneurs frequently did not. They migrated, reestablished themselves, and rebuilt wealth in new jurisdictions. The value was not in what they owned, but in what they could do and how quickly others recognized its usefulness. The same pattern appears in modern financial crises. When capital controls trap money inside a country, individuals with globally demanded skills and relationships retain options. They can earn abroad, invoice internationally, or relocate entirely. The state can tax income, but cannot retroactively seize future earning capacity without crossing into forced labor, which sits far outside the legal norms of modern governance. Reputation functions similarly. A trusted name, a verified track record, or a widely recognized brand of personal credibility cannot be reassigned by law. It exists in the minds and choices of others. Attempting to confiscate, it would require controlling not just institutions, but belief itself. Governments can smear, regulate, or restrict platforms, but reputation, once distributed across many independent actors, does not collapse easily. Networks add another layer of resistance. Value embedded in relationships does not reside in one place. It is not stored. It is activated. States can disrupt specific connections, but wide, cross-border networks regenerate. This is why diasporas often retain economic influence long after losing formal assets at home. Their wealth is relational, not territorial. Crucially, this asset class does not avoid the state by hiding. It coexists with it. It pays taxes where required. It complies where sensible. Its resilience comes from optional exit, not from evasion. The ability to change jurisdictions, counterparties, or legal environments without destroying value is what makes interference expensive and unattractive. This also explains why most people systematically undervalue this form of wealth. It does not align with how success is measured in stable times. Societies train people to optimize for credentials, titles, and ownership precisely because those are rewarded within existing systems. The same structures that make these achievements visible also make them fragile under systemic stress. Another reason is psychological. Tangible assets feel real. Skills feel abstract. Ownership feels permanent. Capability feels conditional. Yet crises repeatedly invert these intuitions. Ownership can be revoked or diluted. Capability, once acquired and continuously renewed, persists. There is also a political reason this asset class is rarely emphasized. States depend on it. Economies function because people possess transferable skills, judgment, and initiative. To explicitly frame these qualities as an asset class beyond state reach would highlight a limit of sovereignty that governments prefer not to discuss. It is easier to regulate things than to regulate people's capacity to create value elsewhere. None of this means that human capital is immune to harm. States can make environments hostile. They can raise barriers. They can extract more value through taxation. But these actions change incentives rather than transferring ownership. The asset is pressured, not confiscated. That distinction matters enormously in extreme scenarios. When viewed this way, the central claim becomes precise. The asset class governments cannot easily confiscate is not protected by secrecy, encryption, or physical hardness. It is protected by dispersion, portability, and dependence on voluntary exchange. It survives not because the state is powerless, but because meaningful seizure would require violating principles free movement, contractual autonomy, personal liberty that underpin modern legal systems themselves. In every major crisis, a small group emerges relatively intact, not because it gets the right hedge, but because their wealth was not locked inside the system under stress. They did not need permission to reconstitute value. Their assets did not need to be unfrozen, revalued, or redeemed. They simply continued operating. The uncomfortable implication is that true resilience cannot be bought all at once. It must be built over time. It requires investment in abilities, credibility, and structures that remain useful even when rules change. This is why it is boring in bull markets and decisive in breakdowns. In the end, the most confiscation-resistant asset is the one that does not need defending because it does not sit still long enough to be taken.